So, Klaus, I understand the two of you had a meeting, Ellen and you had a meeting in your office late this afternoon. What deal did you come up with for the future of Europe?
Well, actually, we had the cake and ate it too. And I think that's one of the recipes we have to look for by cooking this Brexit. The task is really quite difficult because we don't know yet what the British government or even the British Parliament would like to do and what the relationship should look like. And so we have to wait and see until they tell us what they want to achieve. But we discussed all the topics, and you can perhaps identify at least 5 to 10 different negotiations or treaties you would need up to set up a new relationship. Now, this is not only about divorce, which is Article 50 of the European Union, but it's about setting up a process that is somehow reliable and transparent, in particular for businesses that, as German businesses do, supply roughly 400,000 jobs in the UK. Now, many people don't recognize that the German-British relationship is very deep in economic terms. We have roughly 175 billion euros of bilateral trade each year. We have more than 100 billion euros invested in the UK. There are thousands of German companies and Japanese and US companies who do lots of manufacturing, but also parts of services. And all of them have thousands of questions. You know, what does it mean for our tariff system? Do we have to pay tariffs on trade between us? What does it mean in terms of regulation and standards? What does it mean in terms of the membership of the UK in the WTO? What does it mean in terms of benefiting from preferential trade agreements the EU has signed with 50 states and so on? And that's, you know, a whole range of topics that have to be settled before we know what is the impact of that exercise.
You're at the Federation of German Industries, so you will get questions from companies. And to get practical, let's assume I run a medium-sized company somewhere in Germany that delivers, as a supplier, goods to UK-based car manufacturers. And let's assume Brexit means Brexit and it's going to be a hard Brexit. What really changes, you know, beginning with the paperwork and so on? I mean, what kind of either administrative hassle or nightmare is that going to be so that we really get the sense of the practical life impact in some sense?
Well, you really have to go through the whole chain of economic interactions. So it becomes really complicated. The easiest question is, can you still export to the United Kingdom? That is a decision that the British government can take easily, and if they replicate many of the rules on the day of the exit, then you are still probably allowed to sell your input into car manufacturing into the UK. The more serious question is whether car manufacturing in the UK will still happen to the same extent as before, because maybe you have sold most of the cars you produce in the United Kingdom to the rest of Europe and to the rest of the world. And maybe the market access backwards for your product to the single market is restricted or faces the typical 10% tariff on finished cars, or you find a situation in which the standard that is governing the product in the UK is not the same as in Europe any longer. Now, this might not, you can deal with all these different issues, but until you have fixed it in legal terms, companies don't know whether their market still exists, whether the conditions for supplying intermediate goods are still the same, whether they face tariffs or other barriers, and whether the finished product that is produced in the United Kingdom will in the end qualify somehow as a European product now, and has access to the market in the rest of the world and in Europe.
We know that this has been the year of bad news for VW. And we know that VW is also aside from BMW, the premier car manufacturer of luxury cars through Bentley and other things in the UK. Could this potentially mean more bad economic news for Volkswagen then?
It might mean more bad economic news for car companies in general, whether they are German or American or Japanese who are producing in the United Kingdom, depending on what exactly the shape of the various negotiations might take. And so I think the uncertainty is pretty big. Until the UK exits from the EU, which might, on reasonable accounts, be 2 years after they announce their desire to do so, maybe in April 2019, you have a period in which there is not much change. But of course, the question is what will happen after that? And will you have only an exit agreement? Or will you have an interim agreement that settles somehow the trade relationship for the time being until you end up with a final comprehensive deal that we are trying to do with Canada and the United States right now? All this takes time. As we do know, you have political ratification procedures for such agreements that take at least 2 or 3 years on each side. And you need years of negotiation to set things like that up, except for the case that the British government and the EU agree early on that for some interim period you can sort of arrange a soft Brexit where you keep parts of the rulebook as it stands or change it only very gradually, and you determine how exactly these things are supposed to work.
From what you hear from your membership companies based in Germany, the leaders of the Brexit campaign are saying, don't worry because our foreign partners will fight hard to keep us inside the club. We can have our cake and eat it too. How realistic is that from what you hear?
Well, probably politically that's almost impossible to achieve because the unity of the EU 27 in terms of keeping up the standards of the single market and the four freedoms and the freedom of movement of workers and people in general will be very at the top priority for all governments. And so the idea that you somehow can fudge the issues to a large extent on a part of the European Union is unrealistic. So I think the question is actually up to the British government whether they want to accept the obligations of achieving such an interim agreement and the corresponding rules that go along with that, or whether they take the risk of having a hard break, at least for a period of many years until they have finally maybe settled a new relationship. But in that long break or long interim period where you don't have a good rule book, companies might relocate production, relocate trading patterns, and reduce employment and all the rest of it. And so that's the big choice that actually the UK has to do.
What I hear you say also is that German industry isn't exactly worried about this too much. It would prefer it wouldn't happen. But, things are always changing. German export industries have existed for at least 150 years, and they've always had to contend with shifting global market environments. If the UK wants to exit, the news line is that you do not seem to expect German business to fight extra hard for something that is a choice the Brits have made and that can't be prevented because the ball is in their court to figure out how to deal with this. Is that sort of a correct
Actually, I think politically you're right. Of course, given the sluggish global growth and trade environment, nobody likes to have a weak partner in Europe. And, Britain is our third most important trading partner. It's a big, good, until now, recently, well-growing economy. And, the deterioration of that relationship is bad news anyhow. And maybe the one additional factor that makes the difference between a gradual recovery of the world economy and a sudden stop of that. There are certain macroeconomic risks associated with that. Markets might lose trust in the political process of settling the new relationship and either send the pound sterling or the stock market into a long-term decline. All this might have a strong negative impact on business with the UK. So we are not happy about that, no doubt, but clearly political priority is about 93% of trade, not about the 7% with the UK.
Thank you very much, Klaus. What I hear you say is that the Germans, who are otherwise known to see a glass always as half empty, aren't so worried. That's, I think, a very interesting takeaway.